Saudi Arabia is in the midst of building a greater Saudi empire. The nation has been consolidating more and more power in the Middle East, with the Americans having almost fully withdrawn from the region and are pulling out of global trade. It has left the Middle East with almost no American military presence to keep the peace, and so the two main powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are looking to both rule the region for themselves. But Saudi Arabia seems like it has the upper hand, especially with its ridiculously deep pockets that could buy the most powerful weapons ever created. It could then look to establish regional dominance, founding a greater Saudi empire over the Middle East. We can see this process already happening. The growing exerted influence by the House of Saud all across the Middle East shows their expanding power base, establishing a greater Saudi empire across the region. The wars in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen have provided fertile ground for territorial expansion, and the Saudis are only getting more powerful. Through genius geopolitical planning, the West and China is fully dependent on the Saudi oil. And so if Saudi Arabia were to ramp up its conquest to rule the Middle East, the West could do nothing to stop them, and it might just end up with Saudi Arabia entering into the top ranks of powers in the world, and an empire that could last centuries. Saudi Arabia is an already immensely powerful nation, one that has used its huge blessing of oil to become unfathomably wealthy. This kind of wealth has been seen all throughout the Middle East, but not without tension from main rival Iran. The rivalry has lasted over 40 years since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, causing the Ayatollah to declare Iran as the home of Islam, the title that Saudi Arabia had claimed, as it holds the two holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. Saudi Arabia now had direct competition with another Islamic state that was also radically becoming rich. Whilst the two sides have never declared war on each other, they have indirectly fought in other parts of the region by supporting opposing sides, contesting more for influence in the region and who calls the shots. Saudi Arabia supported the rebels in the Syrian civil war whilst Iran backed President Assad. When disobedience erupted in Yemen, the Saudis backed the government and the Iran supported the rebels. And in Iraq, after the United States came in and toppled Saddam Hussein, they left a huge power vacuum that got filled by violent and disorderly militias that the Saudis and Iranians supported opposing sides of. All these wars represent a larger conflict at play here between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and them both vying for dominance and control over the region. But the last 40 years has actually been the most peaceful time in Middle Eastern history. The US, which has the largest and most capable military forces in the world, has policed the world's oceans and has not allowed for major wars to break out between any main powers. The threat of the US coming in and siding with whoever was being invaded was too high a cost for Saudi Arabia or Iran to even think about getting involved in any wars between them. But that's all changing. Since the US has pulled out of Afghanistan, they basically now have no military presence in all of the Middle East. There is bipartisan support for the US to pull out of the region entirely and not return. The Americans are now energy exporters since the shale revolution and now have no legitimate need to be stationed there. The US has never used Persian Gulf oil and has only protected it since as the rest of the developed world is addicted to the stuff. But America has now just become sick of the region, and alike to when the Americans left Iraq, a huge power vacuum is emerging that is going to be filled by one of three powers: Iran, Saudi Arabia, or Turkey. And with the threat of US intervention going away, the Saudis and Iranians have nothing stopping them from going to war, and both sides are gearing up to fight for dominance over the region. With this reason, we will probably see Saudi Arabia move to occupy the territories of southern Syria and Iraq, and set up a second offensive towards the south of the peninsula, and occupy the government-controlled areas of Yemen in exchange for a big check to the Yemenis government. With the overreaching control, they already have Lebanon as well. But this can only be achieved with one big asterisk: Saudi Arabia is looking to go nuclear. The golden rule of nuclear weapons is you only use nukes if you don't believe you can win in conventional warfare. And the downfall of the Saudis is their weak military. The Saudi army is not very strong, but they have one thing that can solve this problem: money. In order to take over these regions, Saudi Arabia will need the nuclear backup in order to have the ability to hold that over any other powers that get involved. It is the great equalizer, because if Iran decides to get involved, Saudi Arabia will want the ability to wreck Iran with a single command. Iran does not have nuclear abilities and doesn't even have the delivery system or a single hope of developing one in a suitable time frame to be able to retaliate with their own nukes on Saudi Arabia. The way the Saudis also plan to solve their weak military problem is to pay local militias Americas to side with them and form a larger alliance of these much smaller, more independent forces to take over control of the area. The world also has very limited powers to stop Saudi Arabia from expanding into these areas. If they impose the same sanctions on Saudi Arabia that have been imposed on Russia, the global oil price would break through the damn ceiling and would cause a crippling recession larger than the Great Depression for Europe, and not to mention China. That would be brought to a halt overnight on Monday, and then by Friday would have a mass famine killing millions of people because of just how dependent East Asia is on Persian Gulf oil. And because China is the global manufacturing belt, by extension the rest of the world would suffer beyond imagine. Saudi Arabia can also invoke this on their own merit. Iran for years has threatened about closing the Strait of Hormuz, which they could pull off pretty easily and sustain for a while before the destroyers show up. The Saudis, however, could pull that off in the matter of seconds. They have effectively full control over the strait, and so the West and China is largely beholden to whatever Saudi Arabia says so long as it uses the Persian Gulf oil. And new oil projects would not even meet a tenth of the supply that comes out of the Persian Gulf, meaning that the world is dependent on Saudi oil and could not intervene, as the threat of pulling the plug would be economic suicide to the highest order. But is Iran a real threat to this potential dominance over the Middle East from Saudi Arabia? Well, realistically it absolutely is. Iran has a population 2.5 times that of Saudi Arabia's and a much larger and more coherent military. However, while Iran is much stronger than Saudi Arabia militarily, I doubt that Iran would last long in a war. It is a ridiculously unstable nation that is also very prone to revolution. And if the Ayatollah tried to intervene militarily directly with Saudi Arabia, and it were to begin to lose the war, the leadership base would collapse in an instant and likely enter into civil war under many different warlords. And for what Saudi Arabia lacks in its military strength, it makes up for twofold in geopolitical strategy. They could use their control over the oil to barter with the West for their support in the war. And with the trillions and trillions of dollars in the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, and the trillions in other funds the world doesn't know about, they have the wealth to buy any weapons or support they need to maintain their empire and dominance over the Middle East and suppress Iran. Ultimately, the Saudi game plan could work extremely well. They already influence these areas heavily and could easily move to become a greater Saudi empire. But we will wait and find out what happens. A final note from me: less than 1% of the viewers on this channel have subscribed, and I would personally ask if you have enjoyed this video to click the subscribe button, because simply the bigger the channel gets, the better the videos get, and the more value you get. So please subscribe. Now watch why India and China will go to war, or why the UK is collapsing.